Stay tuned for Butler on Business, coming up next on the Liberty Express.
I'll tell you who is not down, and that's my next guest, Laurence Kotlikoff. And I want to thank you, listeners, for forwarding me Lawrence's article. It appeared in Forbes magazine, but let me tell you who you're about to listen to. He co-authored a book along with Scott Burns entitled The Clash of Generations. He is a professor up there at Boston University. Do they call you Larry?
Yeah, Larry's fine.
Or Dr. Larry? Dr. Larry?
It's just Larry.
Okay, and then let's
forget the doctor stuff.
Okay,
I'm not a doctor.
All right, now how do they get a hold of the Clash of Generations?
You can buy it over Amazon or maybe in the local bookstore. Bookstores are better than Amazon because they need to be supported. I've got another book that people might be interested in, which is about the financial crisis called Jimmy Stewart is Dead, and that was published by Wiley. So anyway, if people go to my website, Cutlikoff.net, they can see what I'm up to on books and columns and so forth.
Now on to the article. Blink.
Okay.
The U.S. debt just grew by $11 trillion. Now, we all saw the drama of the debt ceiling, but the result was they agreed to keep growing the growth. The size of government was at 50% over the next 10 years. And yet we face a fiscal crisis that these guys just do not seem to be willing to address. Where do we end? What's the end game? What happens if they don't address this problem?
Well, yeah, well, the whole thing is going to end up worse than Greece, far worse. The problem is that two problems. One is that they're not looking at the right numbers, so they're looking at the official debt when we have all these unofficial liabilities to pay. For example, the baby boomers, there's 78 million of us. We're going to be collecting about $40,000 per person in today's dollars on average when we're fully retired. That's going to be about $3.2 trillion a year in today's dollars. It's just an enormous liability that the government's going to have to pay, and it's not on the books. It's kept off the books, so that because of the way we've run this Ponzi scheme and recorded it through time. So it's looking at the wrong numbers, and then not even trying to fix the official debt, let alone deal with the unofficial debt. So when I said that there's a fiscal gap of in this article, in this column of $222 trillion, and that it's gone up over the last year by $11 trillion, that's the truth, and it's all based on Congressional Budget Office data and on their projections. So we're really, really, really screwed.
Larry,
we're really broke.
The difference between under GAAP accounting on December the 24th, Christmas Eve, they snuck out their GAAP accounting for the previous fiscal year, and it was north of $5 trillion. Where are you picking up the extra $6 trillion?
Well, all I'm doing is very simply taking the CBO's projections from June, which is called the alternative fiscal scenario, and just extending them into the future, and then forming a present value, and then comparing that from one year to the next. A lot of this fiscal gap grew under, we had about an $80 trillion fiscal gap in the early 2000s, and then President Bush, the latter, proceeded to cut taxes 3 times and expand Medicare with Part D. Now, I'm not opposed to some of these programs. I think I think the government needs to be heavily involved in health care and making sure that the elderly have insurance against excessive drug costs. But to leave all the bills unpaid and left for the next generation for our kids is just immoral. And Thomas Jefferson is rolling in his grave over this. And Social Security itself is 31% underfinanced. If you just look at Social Security, even if you count the trust fund, the trustees report in Table 4B6 shows that nobody's looking at, shows that that system just by itself is 31% underfunded, meaning we need a 4 percentage point hike in the payroll tax. So basically for every U.S. worker, 4 cents more out of each dollar they earn has to be taken just to keep Social Security solvent. That's, so we've got massive problems that aren't being discussed. They're being hidden. And they're going to catch up with us. And every year that we wait, the problem gets worse because you get closer to having to pay the baby boomers this enormous amount of money. So the present value, the value in the present gets larger as you get closer to having to pay the bill.
And that underfunded 30% for Social Security is if you give those IOUs that are in there face value, because there is no money in the trust fund. There's just IOUs. They've already spent the money.
Well, it's a bit of an accounting argument whether there are or there aren't. I don't want to kind of get into that, but you really need to look at the entire fiscal enterprise collectively, and that's what this fiscal gap, this $222 trillion calculation does. So, you know, the trust fund of the Social Security system is an asset to that system, but it's also a liability to the Treasury. So when you put everything together, these things kind of net out, and you get the true picture for the overall federal government situation. And it's like a balance sheet for the federal government. Here's, in present value, here's all the spending that we have coming in the future as projected by the CBO. Here's all the taxes. And does the spending cover the tax? I mean, does the taxes in present value cover the spending? And the difference is called the fiscal gap. And the answer is no. We're short $222 trillion. It would take a 64% immediate and permanent hike in all federal revenues for all time. So in other words, if you look at the projected path of federal revenues, that path of revenues has to be 64% higher for starting today and continuing forever in order to come up with $222 trillion in present value. So the situation is terribly grave. The CBO is not, coming up with crazy numbers. It's just the situation is that bad. And nobody is really putting these numbers together in this manner and reporting it, although every economist in the country should be, because this is basic economics. This is basically what we call the intertemporal budget constraint of a country, and that's what the fiscal gap is talking about. And that's the basic measure of fiscal sustainability, and we're not in a sustainable fiscal policy.
We're speaking with Dr. Laurence Kotlikoff, author of the book, The Clash of Generations. Tell us about the book. What are the themes in the book?
Well, we look at, first of all, we talk about catastrophic success, the fact that Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, that these programs have done enormous good for a huge number of people at a terrible cost to our children that's coming. In other words, it's great to have a party, but then somebody has to pay for it. And we've been we're now in the process of taking huge sums. So we're going to have to take huge sums from our kids to pay not just the benefits of old people who are now alive and who passed away all old people, but poor old people. But we're also going to have to pay for Warren Buffett's benefits and the increase that he's going to get over the rest of his life. So you've got poor kids being forced to pay for Warren Buffett's Medicare and Medicare increases, and that's just not right. Even Warren Buffett would tell you that. So the first part of the book starts out with this discussion of catastrophic success and talks about the demographics in interesting, fun ways. My co-author is Scott Burns, who's a syndicated columnist. So we've got some very interesting ways of looking at the situation. And then we talk about this fiscal gap, and we talk about where it's coming from and and then we discuss how to fix it. And we point out that this is not likely to get fixed. And then we talk about how people can protect themselves personally, what kind of personal financial moves they need to make to try and keep themselves safe.
Laurence Kotlikoff, ladies and gentlemen, author of the book, along with his buddy Scott Burns, The Clash of Generations. Larry, I'd love to have you back.
Anytime. My pleasure.